Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. I found a strange door in my son's bedroom. My 2-year-old son, Carter, has always been what the doctors called a normal toddler. Like any other kid his age, he sometimes had tantrums or splattered his food all over the wall. Occasionally, he caught a fever from eating God knows what, or refused to go to sleep until after midnight. What comforted my wife Annabelle and I was the knowledge that all of that was normal. By and large, our son was healthy, happy, and growing more every day. Until he woke up screaming 4 nights ago. At first, I thought it had to do with the move. We had recently transitioned from a cramped apartment in the city to a 2-story house in the suburbs. The whole neighborhood had been built in the 1950s, and it showed. Every one of the homes was eerily similar to each of the others, and all of them needed repairs. Still, the bones of the structure were solid. So what if there were a few leaks in the basement? So what if the lights didn't work in the upstairs hallway? The important thing was that our little family finally had a place that we could call our own. Or so I thought. The truth was, Annabelle and I were both expecting that Carter would have trouble adjusting to our new home. We had read books about children whose personalities changed or even suffered trauma as a result of being suddenly uprooted from a familiar environment. But Carter was thrilled by the change. He zoomed through the house, yelling excitedly into every closet and cupboard. To us, the worn old house felt small, but for our son, it must have seemed like the biggest playground ever. He slept 12 hours that night, and Annabelle and I finally got some time alone. Carter was just as enchanted by the house on the second day. While Annabelle and I unpacked, he built forts with cardboard boxes or climbed around inside the kitchen cabinets. We let Carter pick his bedroom, and he chose the smaller room on the left. When I asked him why, he just grinned. "Funny doors." Carter laughed, then ran away without any further explanation. I was left scratching my head. My son's room had only one door, the one that led to the hallway and to the bedroom I would be sharing with Annabelle. Why had Carter said doors? I figured that it was just toddler logic and forgot all about it. My wife traveled a lot for work, but she had taken a week off to help with the move. Since he showed every sign of being well adjusted, she left for her first business trip last Monday. And that's where the trouble started. It had been a perfectly ordinary night. Beef stew for dinner, bath time, pajamas, story time, and sleep. While Carter dozed, I wrapped up in the cozy plaid bathrobe that Annabelle had bought me last Father's Day and read an old Raymond Chandler novel until I felt sleepy enough to turn out the light. A piercing shriek woke me. Carter. The digital alarm clock beside my bed read 1:44 a.m. I stumbled out of bed and down the lightless hallway to my son's room. I found him standing in his crib, pointing at the wall and screaming. This wasn't teething pain, hunger, or a stomachache. This was pure, unfiltered terror. "What's the matter, buddy?" I asked as I picked him up. "Does something hurt? Did you have a nightmare?" "Da run," Carter mumbled, over and over. "Ba ma, da run." My son can usually speak complete words without a problem, but he was too agitated that night. It took 10 minutes of rocking just to stop the screaming, and even then, I still couldn't make out what he was trying to say through his tears. I offered water, a snack, and even told him that he could stay with me in the big bed if he wanted. But Carter just shook his head. There didn't seem to be any option except to lay him back in his crib. My son grabbed his favorite stuffed animal, a fat purple gecko, and rolled over, staring at the wall like his life depended on it. After a few minutes, his eyes closed, his breathing regulated, and I could finally get back to sleep. Although Annabelle wasn't around to witness the weird event, I mentioned it during our video call the next evening. Her advice was simple: give it one more night. If something else happened, I could move Carter's crib into our bedroom or set up the baby cam that we had quit using several months before. That second night was the first time that Carter had ever seemed nervous about going to bed. Even while I was giving him his bath, He kept craning his neck to look behind me, as though he were afraid some monster was going to come creeping in from the hallway. Even after I shut the bathroom door, his tiny fingers kept a white-knuckle grip on the edge of the tub, like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. "Just holler if you need anything, okay, buddy?" I reminded him, before ruffling his hair and turning out the light. "Sleep tight." When I got back to my bedroom, I couldn't help but look back over my shoulder. Carter was just a black lump in the crib on the far wall. He looked so small and fragile, clinging to his purple gecko plushie like his life depended on it. I wanted to stay by his side, but I knew that I couldn't be there every night, and that some battles he would have to learn to fight alone. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, too restless to sleep. I was waiting, I realized, for my son to scream. After 1:45 a.m. passed without a sound from Carter's room, I finally relaxed. Maybe it had just been a nightmare, after all. At some point I must have dozed off, because when my eyes opened, it was to the sound of my son's piercing cry. Just like before, I ran to Carter, but what I saw in the hallway stopped me in my tracks. It was me, standing in the dimly lit doorway of my son's room. This version of me had wild hair, bloodshot eyes, and an enraged expression on its face. "Hey!" I shouted, sprinting forward. My other self moved too, and only then did I realize that I was looking at a mirror. There was a full-length mirror on the back of Carter's bedroom door. I had never noticed it before, but then again, we had moved in so recently. A cheap mirror on the back of a door would have been an easy thing for the old owners to forget. And since Annabelle and I rarely opened Carter's door all the way, we might have simply overlooked it. Maybe that had been the problem. My son was waking up in the middle of the night and getting scared by his own reflection. As much as I wanted to believe it, I couldn't help but wonder what had opened the door. Something else was bothering me, too. Carter's stuffed purple gecko was gone. Sometimes he threw it out of the crib, where it usually bounced under the mattress or got lost in the laundry. But that night, the plushie was nowhere to be found. Nah. Carter was rambling again. "Darum." He wasn't making any more sense than he had the day before, but at least he calmed down faster. He reached out for his crib like he couldn't wait to get back inside of it and hide beneath the covers. Anything else I offered him only made that horrible wailing start up again. Although I didn't like the way he lay there, the sheet half covering his face like a murder victim in a mortuary, it seemed to be the only thing keeping him calm and relaxed. He was hiding, I realized with a shiver, hoping that whatever had scared him so badly wouldn't find him before the morning. The dark hallway connecting our rooms was also colder than I remembered. I put on the striped bathrobe that Annabelle had bought me last Father's Day and lay down on my bed to read. I wanted to get lost in those dusty yellowed pages, but I just couldn't focus. For one thing, my bookmark wasn't where I remembered leaving it. I had to go back almost 10 pages just to remember what was going on. For another, I would have sworn that my bathrobe had been plaid, not striped. No matter how many times I paced the bedroom or peeked out the door to make sure that Carter was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that had burrowed down deep into my gut. During my video call with Annabelle the next day, I was almost afraid to mention the whole episode. She still had a full day left in her business trip, and I didn't want her to think that I was losing my grip on things back home. I asked about the mirror, but she said she couldn't remember seeing one in Carter's room. Later, when I mentioned the bathrobe, an odd expression crossed her face. The truth is, I couldn't decide. I had narrowed it down to those two patterns, but I was running late, so I just closed my eyes and picked one at random. It turned out to be stripes, but it could just as easily have been plaid. Annabelle hesitated. "Anyway, about Carter, why don't you just set up the baby monitor? That way you'll know for sure what's going on in there." We still hadn't fully unpacked, and it took me a while to locate the tiny camera that we had used to watch Carter when he was a newborn. I set it up on a chair facing his crib, and while I was at it, I also took down the mirror. I couldn't explain why, but the damn thing gave me a bad vibe, like it wasn't supposed to be there, like it didn't really belong in our house. Just like the night before, Carter became unusually quiet after sunset. He kept his eyes glued to the clock, nervously counting down the minutes until nightfall. I tried to distract him with his favorite game, hide and seek, but he didn't want to leave my side. I could understand why. Without Annabelle around, the house felt too quiet. Our voices echoed strangely in the half-empty rooms, and I think we were both relieved when it was finally time for bed. Carter rolled over to look at the wall as soon as I laid him in his crib. I had the unsettling thought that he was just pretending to sleep, but I was too exhausted from the day to do anything about it. I skipped my nightly routine, instead taking a shot of bourbon to calm my nerves and sitting down in front of the computer monitor. From there, I could watch the night vision footage from the room at the end of the hall. At first, there was nothing to see but Carter tossing and turning in his sleep, his hands grasping unconsciously for his missing toy. I poured myself another shot. When I looked back at the screen, my son's eyes were wide open. In the dark, they looked like two black, empty pits. His jaw dropped in terror at the sight of something behind the camera. Something that I couldn't see. The camera fell to the floor with a crash. My son disappeared from view. I fumbled uselessly for a weapon, and, finding none, ran down the hallway, empty-handed. What I found on the other side of the tightly closed door was the last thing I expected. My son was sleeping peacefully, only the camera had been disturbed. It lay on its side, its wiry plastic guts scattered across the hardwood. Beside it was Carter's stuffed purple gecko. Was it possible that my son had found his stuffed animal, hurled it across the room to destroy our nanny cam, then fallen back asleep immediately? Maybe. It was even the most logical explanation, but I couldn't bring myself to believe it. The more I tried to convince myself, the more certain I was that there was an intruder in my son's room. Almost unwillingly, I turned my head from side to side, searching. My eyes fixed on the wall beside me, the one Carter had been looking at in the video. There was a second doorway there. I blinked. To my right was the hallway I had come from. I could see the soft yellow light of my bedside lamp glowing beneath the door. To my left was another hallway, one that I was sure hadn't been there a few hours ago. It looked as lightless and empty as the void of space. Was that what my son had been trying to say? Darum, dark room? If so, what did Ba-Ma mean? I was curious because now that I thought about it, Carter's words had sounded an awful lot like bad man. Dark room, bad man. I shuddered. Before I could decide what to do about the impossible doorway, I heard footsteps approaching from the other side. I glanced down at my son, sleeping soundly. Whatever was out there, the most important thing was protecting Carter. I scooped him up from his crib and rushed back to my own bedroom. While Carter squirmed and asked what was going on, I barred the door with a chair, pressed my eye to the keyhole, and listened. A man-sized figure stood in the doorway of Carter's room. It hesitated for a moment, then charged. Between its speed and the darkness, I couldn't make out any of its features. But whatever it was strong. It shook the door handle so hard that I thought it would rip it clear out of the wood. When that didn't work, it started slamming its bulk furiously against the door. The first impact made the door rattle on its hinges. The second splintered the wood. I doubted the door would survive a third. I had already dialed the police. I left the phone on speaker mode while I grabbed Carter, covered his mouth with my hand, and crawled beneath the bed. It was a silly, obvious place to hide, but it was all I could think of to do. Shh, I begged my son. We hid in silence as 911, "What's your emergency?" became "Remain on the line, and the nearest available officer will respond to your call." The lock held, for a little while at least. A final blow sent the chair I had braced it with flying across the room. I could hear ragged, panting breaths in the darkness. The floorboards groaned beneath heavy footsteps. I held Carter close and prepared for the worst. Sirens. My eyes snapped open. Flashing red and blue lights poured in through the windows. The intruder froze, muttered something in disbelief, then fled back down the hallway. From the first floor, I heard urgent knocking. Shouts of "Police!" and "Open up!" reverberated through the house. I hurried downstairs with Carter before they could kick in the door. The officers cleared the whole house, but there was no sign of any intruder or the strange doorway. I didn't mention Carter's dark room in the report I filed. I didn't want to risk being deemed mentally incompetent or a danger to my son. The officers were already suspicious of the bourbon on my breath. The only thing to support my story was my bedroom door, which hung from its splintered hinges like a drunk clinging to a lamppost. And of course, I could have done that myself. More than anything, I missed Annabelle. Fortunately, I would be picking her up from the airport in just a few hours. As the sun came up, I fed Carter his oatmeal and booked us a bland, boring hotel room for the next 2 days. There was no way in hell I was going to risk my son's life by spending another night in that house. I packed as quickly as I could, sure that I had forgotten at least half the things that my son needed for 2 days out of the house. I kept getting distracted. What if I glanced up from the suitcase and found that Carter, or the closet door, had disappeared? What if, when we tried to leave, the house didn't let us? I gripped Carter's wrist and kept my eyes straight ahead as we marched out of the house. If some awful grinning face was watching us from the upstairs window, I didn't want to know about it. After the engine started, I could breathe again. We were going to make it. It was raining when we picked Annabelle up from the airport, a gray, misty rain that made everything that had happened in the last few days feel somehow less real. My wife looked dubiously at the half-zipped suitcases stuffed into the back seat, then at Carter's confused, tear-streaked face. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she wasn't convinced by my story. It hurt, but I couldn't say I blamed her. After all, which was more likely? That stress from work, a move, and caring for a toddler had caused a mental breakdown, or that a portal to nowhere had opened up in a boring suburban home. The only question now was whether Annabelle would stay by my side in spite of her doubts, or try to get as far away from me as possible. When we entered the lobby of the hotel I'd booked, my heart was in my throat. If she asked the desk clerk to call Child Protective Services or alert the authorities, there would be nothing I could do. I would be locked away until my name was cleared, and Annabelle would be free to take Carter back to that house. I could sense her doubt as we walked up to the front desk, but all Annabelle did was smile and ask for the keys. My wife had chosen to stand by me. So what if the air smelled like burnt coffee and cleaning supplies? So what if the ice machine's rattle went right through the paper-thin walls? As far as I was concerned, the hotel room meant safety. It meant an end to sleepless nights spent running down that lightless hallway, unsure of what I might find on the far end. I could have cried for joy. I dumped the suitcases and threw myself onto one of the ugly beds. Carter climbed up too, giggling and tickling me. For a few seconds, I could almost pretend we were a normal, happy family again. Annabelle, however, stayed silent. "What?" I whispered after we had turned on the television to distract Carter. "It's just," my wife hesitated. "You're different." "Different?" I peeked through the bathroom door at the mirror. My hair was a mess, and there were dark circles under my eyes. But none of that was news to me. Different how? I don't know. When Annabelle shouted so loudly that Carter looked up from his cartoons, she brought a hand to her forehead. "All this is just a lot, okay? I need time." Until that moment, I hadn't had a plan, but what I needed to do was suddenly crystal clear. I understand. That's why I'm going back to the house tonight. My wife opened her mouth to protest, but I shook my head. It's better for all of us this way. Carter had turned back to the TV screen, where a frightened white rabbit was running up an endless flight of stairs, pursued by an axe-wielding devil wearing a jester's cap. I had never seen the program before, and while it was probably supposed to be funny, under the circumstances, it sent a shiver up my spine. I picked up my overnight bag, gave Annabelle a kiss on the cheek, then left the hotel room. Terror seized me the moment the door closed. What if I had made an unforgivable mistake? I was suddenly sure that if I opened the door again, I would discover that my wife and child had vanished, swallowed by whatever strangeness was pursuing our family. I had to know. I fumbled with the key card, tugging on the door handle desperately, while that damned little light flashed red again and again. When I finally crashed inside, I found Annabelle with one arm around Carter's shoulder. She was ready to protect him, but not from any horror movie monster. She was ready to protect him from me. "Sorry," I stammered. "I just forgot something." The nearest thing at hand was a free disposable coffee cup. I grabbed it and stumbled back out into the hotel like a sleepwalker. Since Annabelle would need the car, I took a taxi home. The rain was coming down harder than ever, but it felt like the driver spent more time checking me out in the rearview mirror than watching the road. "What?" I demanded, when he finally came to a stop in my driveway. "Nothing." The man looked down at the meter. "42.75, please." I stuffed a 50 into his hand and told him to keep the change. Inside, the house felt far too quiet. The taxi driver was still idling in my driveway, almost like he was waiting for me to change my mind. What had he seen? What had he been staring at so intently in the rearview mirror? I closed the blinds and tiptoed upstairs. I wished that I'd brought something to protect myself with, even just a kitchen knife or a hammer, but it was too late now. The door to Carter's room stood wide open at the end of the hall. I didn't really expect the mysterious corridor to be there waiting for me, but I was almost disappointed to discover that my son's room was just an ordinary bedroom. 4 white walls, bare hardwood floors, big wide windows. Would it remain that way after nightfall? There was only one way to find out. I started making my preparations right away. Around dinner time, I called to check up on Annabelle and Carter. They were both fine, if a little shaken up. Carter had enjoyed exploring the hotel and splashing in the pool. They had gotten Chinese takeout for dinner. When I told my wife what I was planning, her reply was immediate. "I really wish you wouldn't." "Why not?" I demanded. "What do you think is going to happen?" Carter hooted excitedly in the background. At his age, that couldn't mean anything good. He had probably found an electrical outlet and a fork to stick into it. "I should go," my wife whispered, then hung up. Although I knew she had to take care of Carter, it didn't feel like that was why she got off the phone. It seemed a lot more like she was trying to avoid my question. Sighing, I looked over my setup. A chair hidden behind the door. A cell phone ready to record, facing my son's crib. A baseball bat, a pocket knife, and duct tape. You never know, I figured. I had filled the disposable cup I'd gotten from the hotel to the brim with strong coffee, and I sipped it slowly while I watched the sun go down. The past 3 days had been exhausting, but I couldn't use anything that might create light or sound to keep myself awake. I didn't want to do anything that might change the pattern of the past several nights. I must not fall asleep, I repeated to myself. No matter what, I must not fall asleep. When my eyes snapped open, my watch read 4:17 a.m. Over 2 hours had passed since I'd last checked. It was possible that I had missed the whole thing. Without remembering the need for silence, I sprang to my feet and scanned the room. Nothing was out of place, but there was a new, lightless hallway leading into the wall behind me. I turned, barely daring to breathe. I could feel the cool air pouring out of the impossible space, chilling the sweat on my skin. Gripping my baseball bat, I stepped forward into the darkness. I had decided not to use any light source. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, and I could feel my way along the corridor just fine. The rough paint was familiar beneath my fingertips. This could have been the same corridor that led to my bedroom, except that it hadn't been there just a few hours ago. I knew that there was a room at the end of the hallway only because a light suddenly switched on behind its door. I pressed myself against the wall, waiting. There was movement inside. The door swung open. A dark figure stood backlit by a lamp. It ran a hand through its hair, shouted something, and hurried past me toward my son's bedroom. I held my breath as it passed, but there was no need. It was too distracted to notice my presence in the dark. After the figure passed, I slipped into the well-lit room ahead. I needed to know where it had come from, what it was, and what it wanted with my son. The last thing I had expected was to find myself back in my own bedroom. The plaid bathrobe hanging from the bathroom door, the digital alarm clock, the stack of towels on the dresser. Everything was the same. Or was it? The view out the window was unchanged, but it was covered by curtains. They looked identical to the ones that were still boxed up in the garage because I had never gotten around to hanging them. My Raymond Chandler novel was on the nightstand, but the bookmark was all the way back in the first chapter. What the hell was happening to me? Something in the hallway was coming toward me, muttering. Even though I was armed, I didn't want to risk a confrontation, not until I had a better idea of what was going on. The closet was half open, and I ducked inside, pressing into a wall of familiar yet unfamiliar clothes. Through the cracked open closet door, I could finally get a full view of the thing that had been frightening my son. It was like looking into that mirror. Worse, in a way, because the thing in that bedroom wasn't just my reflection. It was me. Its voice was still distorted, but now I could make out what it was saying. "Carter, where are you, buddy? This isn't funny." The thing that looked like me scratched its head and stroked its 3-day growth of beard, tossing aside pillows, checking under the bed. What would I do when it got to the closet? It left my line of sight. I lifted the bat, my hands slick with sweat. Seconds later it reappeared, a glowing screen in its hand. "Carter? Carter?" it yelled, jogging back out of the bedroom. It was doing exactly what I would have done, making one last sweep of the house, then calling the police. If I wanted to get out of whatever this was and back to my own reality, I realized my time was running out. I took a deep breath and slipped back into the hallway. Somewhere in the darkness, maybe on the first floor of this eerily similar house, I could hear my own disembodied voice, shouting for my son. As I walked, those panicked cries became warped and distorted. Finally, they faded altogether. I could see my son's bedroom up ahead, his crib on the opposite wall, the purple gecko plushie, and the shattered camera on the floor beside it. I was almost there, but the corridor was longer than I remembered. It stretched out beneath my feet like some kind of nightmarish treadmill. The distance between me and the world I knew might be as short as a few feet, or longer than the distance between stars. There was no way to know. From my left, the beam of a wildly waving flashlight illuminated the ceiling. "Hey, stop right there!" someone was shouting. "Hey!" It was coming from the first floor, from the bottom of the stairs in the middle of the hallway. In the shaking flashlight glow, my own face stared furiously up at me. Instead of a baseball bat, this version of me was armed with a butcher knife. "What did you do with my son, you bastard?" It snarled, then lunged. I realized that something about its presence had readjusted the weird space I was trapped in. Suddenly, I was making progress again. Carter's room was still dead ahead. I sprinted as hard as I could, and felt the air change when I crossed over. I didn't turn around until I was beside my son's empty crib, but even so, I knew what I would find behind me, a bare wall. Somewhere out there, beyond impossible distances of space and time, my pursuer was probably about to burst confusedly into its own version of Carter's room. From his perspective, I was the bad man who had come creeping out of a dark room. In my bedroom at the end of the hallway, I could see my phone on its charging station. I hurried back to it, eager to tell Annabelle what I had discovered, until I remembered that my phone should have been set up to record on a chair in Carter's bedroom. Wherever or whatever this place was, it wasn't the same place I had started from. There was movement downstairs, keys jangling, turning in a lock. Somebody was about to come through the front door. I grabbed my bat and crept to the top of the stairs. A dark shape stood on the porch, backlit by the outdoor lamp. It put its keys away, sighed, then stepped inside and turned on the lights. "Annabelle?" I gasped. After so much darkness, the brightness from the first floor was blinding. My wife glared up at me, her face a mix of concern and anger. "You were supposed to pick me up at the airport 4 hours ago. Is everything all right? Where's Carter?" My mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. How could I explain that Carter was with another Annabelle, in another world where we were strangers? Even if I could have found the right words, I already knew that she wouldn't believe me. I wish I could say that this story had a happy ending. I wish I could say that when I returned to Carter's room, I found a passage back to the world where I had left him instead of 4 bare white walls. But that isn't what happened. Instead, I'm going to be back in this room tonight, waiting, hoping to find a way back to my son, hoping that I won't wake up with my own enraged face staring down at me and a knife at my throat. I'd like this story to serve as a warning. Maybe one day you'll be visiting a distant relative or a new friend, or maybe even unpacking boxes in a new home of your own. You'll turn around and notice a door where you were sure there wasn't one before. You might see a familiar-looking room on the other side. You might see a friend, a loved one, or even yourself. You might be tempted to take a walk down that dark corridor. If you do, just make sure that you're aware of the consequences. If that gave you chills, Brace yourself, because the next story is even darker. My mom took in my cousin, but there's something wrong with him. Whenever my mom spoke of my grandfather, she just told me he was a sick who cared more about alcohol than he did his family. The irony that she only told me this when she herself had had a few too many wasn't lost on me. It made me wonder, was being messed up some kind of inheritance, carefully preserved and passed down? Whatever it was, fate, inheritance, just plain dumb genetics, it didn't spare my aunt either. I got the gist of her death: cirrhosis, a night comforting herself in the only way she probably knew, a car accident, and then, well, my cousin Liam moved in with us shortly afterwards. He was small and pale, with a lazy eye. Mom wasn't too excited about getting another mouth to feed, which I thought was rich. I'd been living off of school breakfasts and lunches for the past year, none of which she had paid for. I wasn't too excited either, because Mom had made it clear that he'd be sharing my bedroom with me. What teenage girl is excited to have a 4-year-old roommate? It wasn't that there was much of an alternative, though. Our trailer was tiny, and putting him in the living room would mean that my mother would have to give up her late-night TV. He'd only brought a small backpack, with a change of clothes that looked like they hadn't fit him for months. I knew my mom wasn't going to do anything for him, so I took him to the Goodwill down the street and spent the money I'd scraped up working part-time at the nursing home. I tried not to think how many bedpans I'd emptied for the money, as I held up tiny shirts to his torso. He stared at me. Well, either at me or the mannequin behind me. I couldn't tell which eye was the dominant eye yet. The fitting rooms have been closed permanently, so I just eyed the bottoms as well as I could and checked. The cashier cooed over him, and when I complained about the clothes, maybe not fitting, whispered that I could run home and try them. If they don't fit, come back before I'm off, and I'll give you a refund. Plastic bags jostling my legs, I hustled us back home, practically dragging him behind me. His hand was limp in my grip, and I kept glancing over my shoulder to make sure he was okay. It was then that I realized that I hadn't heard him talk yet. I don't have a ton of experience with little kids. Nursing home and high school are pretty much the only places I go besides home, but that's not normal, right? My mom was in the living room, talking loudly on the phone, so I led him into our room and emptied the bags. Here, get changed. He watched me blankly, and I sighed, leaning over to help. I froze when I saw his arms. Look, I'm not going to get explicit. Last thing I want is some creep reading this, who gets off on the thought of kids getting hurt. All I'm going to say is that someone had been hurting this kid. I dropped his arms, staring at him. He looked back blankly, and I stormed out to yell at my mom. Logically, I knew that this wasn't her fault. It was her sister's, either for doing it or allowing it. But she was dead, and my mom was the closest person that I could blame. We devolved into a screaming competition. I called her sister and we went from there, with her telling me that I didn't know what had haunted her sister in life. By the time I went back to the room, I knew for sure the girl was off her shift, and it didn't really matter if the clothes fit or not. He'd grow into them, because I was going to make sure he got fed. Nothing was going to hurt this kid ever again. I bandaged him up, feed him fish sticks for dinner, and got him into bed before I had to take off for work. I don't know much about parenting, but if our relatives are what doom us, then I wasn't going to be another mark against him. My mother was passed out on the couch when I got home, but I didn't worry about waking her. Gabriel and his horn couldn't wake my mother after she was through drinking on a bad day. Rolling my eyes, I headed for the bathroom, pausing when I noticed that the door to my room was open. I closed it as I passed, no need to wake the kiddo. I wondered if my mom had checked in on him, and then almost laughed. Yeah, right. I started noticing that stuff was off the next couple of days. Doors were open, things in my room, even things that he couldn't reach, had been moved. One night I came in to find my blinds had been torn down, and the window opened. There was no way he was strong enough to do that, so I just assumed my mother had, in a drunken fit, tried to air out the house. That's what I told myself anyways, but I didn't really believe it. My mother had never decided to try and do anything useful while drunk, even if it failed. It wasn't until the weekend, when I had time to help the kid take a bath, that I realized that the wounds weren't healing. In fact, he had more. The tub kept filling and almost overflowed before I caught myself and turned it off. What was going on here? Mo mother was awful, sure, but she'd never hurt a kid, at least not knowingly. I'd been around the kid all other hours of the day, except for when I had work. My next thought was that he was doing this to himself, to cope with losing his mom, and what I'm sure was a childhood. Still, it didn't make sense. He didn't have access to knives, and I don't think he could have cut up his own back. I toweled him off, rebandaged him, and called in sick to work. It hurt, saying goodbye to hours I'd fought so hard for, but this was more important. He still didn't talk, but I tried, squatting down to beat his level, asking him who was hurting him. He didn't answer, still staring off behind me, and I gave up, helping him brush his teeth. I put him to bed, but left the bedroom door open. Mom was off somewhere, probably trying to get drunk, get a man, or both, so for once the TV was off. I made myself comfortable in the living room and started painting my nails. I'd only done my index finger when I heard the door to my bedroom creak shut. I stood up, putting the brush back in the bottle, and went to check. The room was still and dark, but for the lights from the gas station across the road. It took me a moment to see Liam, but he was huddled under the blankets in the little bed I'd made up for him, just as I'd left him. Maybe a draft had blown the door shut? I wedged it open with a dirty uniform and went back to the table. I'd barely done another 2 fingers when I heard the door close again. This time I was faster, rushing to the door and flinging it open, but again, nothing. I noticed then that Liam was shaking underneath the blankets. I knew he couldn't be the one closing the door. There was no way he'd closed the door and made it back under the covers that fast. Liam? I squatted down next to him. Hey, what's going on? He didn't answer, and I pulled back the blankets with my polish-free hand. I gave up the idea of keeping my manicure intact, though, as he started screaming and thrashing. Wow, Liam, it's me. He stopped screaming when he finally saw that it was me, and stared, eyes wide, chest heaving. He looked so little in his 2 big Paw Patrol pajamas that my heart thumped painfully. Who would hurt him? Hey, buddy, what's going on? I sat down, crisscrossing my legs. He shifted his gaze to behind me, and I glanced back surreptitiously. Nothing but the yellow light from the living room. Wait, there was something else. There, right behind me, something was pressing into the carpet. I couldn't see what it was, only the indents in the shag where something was standing. I stopped breathing and mechanically turned around. Let's get you a late-night snack, okay? He was hard for me to pick up, but I managed it, not even looking back as I carried him out of the room. I closed the door right behind me, trying to seem normal about it, like I hadn't noticed what was in there. I held him close as I hurried to the kitchen, and I could feel his little heart beating through his chest. What the heck was that? And why was it hurting him? I made silly faces as I mixed powdered milk with water, but my mind was racing. I remembered Mom had talked about her father and the deal with the devil that killed him more than once, but I'd always figured she was just talking about how he'd drunk himself to an early grave. Maybe not, though. Maybe she'd meant something much more literal. I had no way of contacting her, and she was probably too drunk to tell a coherent story wherever she was. Anyways, what else should I do? Call a priest? That idea seemed best. So I gave it a go while he drank his milk obediently. But when I called the local church, all I got was an answering machine. I thought about the police, but dismissed it. When they saw how beat up he was, he'd be taken away for sure. And I knew that whatever that thing was, it would follow him. What else? What else? A quick Google search revealed that there were as many ways to deal with a monster as there were horror stories. But how could I tell which one worked? If any did. Salt seemed to be a common defense, so I wrenched open the drawer next to the sink. We didn't have salt, really, but I always grabbed lots of packets when my old folks didn't want them. It saved money, even if it was just a little bit. I started ripping open yellow salt packets, dumping salt on the ground, scattering it on the counter around Liam. He watched me, milk mustache drying. I smiled tensely. I'm just trying something, buddy. There was a creak, and despite myself, I turned to watch my bedroom door swing open. It looked perfectly natural, and my stomach twisted. How many times had I come home to doors open that I knew I had left closed? How many times had this poor baby been hurt, hiding under the blankets, alone with no one but my intoxicated mother to protect him? I turned back to see that his gaze was fixed firmly on something I couldn't see, mouth slightly open. He was starting to shiver, and I picked him up again, handing him a salt packet for luck. I watched the salt carefully. The white grains stood out starkly in comparison to the dark linoleum, and I could see clearly that there was something brushing up against the edges, but not moving forward. I breathed a sigh of relief, and they were brushed aside as whatever it was began moving through them. This may sound dumb, but I wasn't too sure what else to do. None of the doors in the trailer were strong enough to keep out a toddler, so I couldn't barricade ourselves in. Holding Liam close, I fled the house. Mom had taken the car, so we couldn't drive off, or even lock ourselves in it. The gas station was closed, except for the pumps, as was everything else. I ran as fast as I dared in my flip-flops, not daring to look away from my feet. "If you see that thing, you have to tell me," I told Liam, voice shaky as I gasped for air. He tightened his arms around my neck, head swiveling against my shoulder. "I see a lot of them." It was the first time he'd spoken, and I almost dropped him. How many?" He didn't answer, just held me tighter. I didn't know where to go. I just kept moving, hoping that I could stay ahead, that we wouldn't get surrounded. Face pressed against me, Liam began making a soft, keening sound. He thought we were doomed. Ahead, there were lights, and I realized that I hadn't been paying any attention to where we were going. I'd just run, and now we were approaching the Target parking lot. In the light, though, I could see movement in the dirt on the sidewalk ahead of me. I paused and looked back. There was something there, too. I didn't think I could climb the chainmail fence my other side, meaning that what I had feared had happened. I clutched Liam close and squatted down like I could fully shield him. I wasn't a good mother figure. I didn't read with Liam. I had no idea if he knew his colors, and he'd just spoken to me for the first time. I didn't know how to take care of anyone besides myself, and I couldn't keep him safe. I realized something as I held him. These creatures had never bothered my mother, and my aunt had died from a car crash. In all likelihood, if I left Liam, they'd leave me alone too. They only wanted him. Back when I was younger, I'd had a neighbor who'd looked out for me when Mom was too hammered to know or care where her daughter was. The neighbor had told me stories about how, in the Bible, when parents sinned, it was held against the kids. But then Jesus had set people straight, because kids weren't supposed to be blamed for their parents' sins. It's just that they were often a casualty. Like me and my bad luck inheritance, like Liam with his inherited demons. Neither of us had ever done anything wrong, and yet we were still doomed by the narrative. But I wasn't going to sacrifice him. "I'm so sorry I can't protect you." I whispered against the back of his head, and he didn't answer. I don't know if you believe in miracles or not. Frankly, I don't care. What happened next was a miracle, and nothing else. A white light washed the area, and I saw them then, the creatures that had followed us. My stomach twisted when I saw how many of them there were. Grotesquely twisted carcasses, skeletons impossibly elongated, faces little more than gaping maws. There was a sound like a bell, and the light faded, but I could still see them. The light hadn't completely faded, haloing the ground next to my feet, and I looked down, seeing for the first time a tire iron wedged in between the concrete and fence. I put Liam down, untangling his arms, and hoisted the iron. It felt warm against my palm, and I turned, keeping Liam behind me. The creatures weren't fast. They didn't need to be. Already, our circle was shrinking. But I am not my mother, and I am not my family. I would rather die fighting than hide. I have to patch myself up several times a week. Whatever they are, they don't come out during the day. I've moved my shifts, so I only work in the daylight on weekends. Not that summer is over. Liam is growing and talking more. His cuts are all finally healed up, but he has some pretty gnarly scars. Mom has a new boyfriend, but as long as she keeps paying the bills, I frankly don't care what she does. I sleep with a baseball bat by my bed, and bells on my door and windows. I guess I'm writing this to say, even if you feel doomed, you're not. You might have to fight like hell, but hey, we are not our parents. Their deals with the devil, their problem, not ours. Good luck, and if you see footprints behind you, run. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the next tale proves you wrong. I purchased a journal at an Algerian market. The final entries told a horrific tale, part 1. I travel a lot. Without getting too in-depth about the particulars of my life and career, I will say that my job ends up taking me all over the world. I've been to just about every continent on the planet, with the exception of somewhere like Antarctica, and the number of countries I haven't stepped foot in rapidly shrinks every year. It's absolutely amazing, as I've been able to see and partake in so many different customs, cultures, and lifestyles. And one thing I always love to do is purchase a souvenir to take home with me, a sort of keepsake, to mark my first time in a new country that I can take down from the shelf and look at when the nostalgia hits me. It can be anything, whether an ornamental figurine, a glass, or a book. That's where the reason I'm writing and posting here comes in. You see, a few months ago, I was sent to Algeria to help oversee a business deal that a client was involved in. The main dealings had wrapped up, and after a few days of exploring the capital city of Algiers, I decided to take a final stroll through one of the many bazaars I had come to adore perusing in my off time the day before my flight left back to the States. I'd already had it in mind to find something to buy as a memento, and so I strolled past the vendors selling fruit and other various foods, looking for something interesting. And as I passed a table which was selling various bits and bobs, it caught my eye. It was an old, leather-bound journal, clasped tightly shut with what appeared to be a belt closure of some kind. The leather looked extremely weather-beaten and worn, as if it had sat in the burning desert sun for decades, and the edges of the pages I could see were yellowed with age. My curiosity piqued. I pointed to it and asked the seller about where it had come from. Rather strangely, he seemed wary of saying exactly where and when it had come into his possession, instead only saying that he'd stumbled across it during his travels. My curiosity now firmly in the red zone due to its mysterious nature, I inquired to its price. He had no sooner quoted me a price than I was pushing the money into his hand. It was practically a steal. However, I admit one thing which unnerved me, to say the least. As I hurried away back in the direction of my hotel, I chanced to look over my shoulder and found that the man was watching me leave, a strange and almost intense look on his face. That night, my bags packed and lying in bed, I found myself unable to sleep. After trying to tempt the Sandman for a few hours, I finally gave up, and wanting something to pass the time, I picked the journal up, unbuckled it, and opened it to the first page. To my surprise, I found the entries were in English. The journal had belonged to a British explorer and adventurer, whose name, according to the inscription on the back of the cover, was Liam Wentworth. The dates inside ranged from the late 1940s to the early 50s, and I read each page with rapt attention, extraordinary images swirling in my mind as Liam narrated to me expeditions which ranged from continental Europe to Africa. I couldn't help but smile as the infectious excitement in his writing pulled me further and further into the past, and I almost wished I could be transported back in time to join him. That was until I began to read the last expedition logged in the journal. From the very first entry, I could tell there was something different about this particular journey. Something about the man's words filled me with an unexplainable sense of unease. And as the entries went on, I felt any sense of excitement and wonder wash away like a flood victim. The initial uneasiness first replaced with tension, then a strange sense of paranoia, and finally, as much as I hate admitting it, fear. A palpable sense of fear and existential dread I've never felt before. One which raised all the hair on my arms and, even in the safety of my hotel room, made me turn on every single light, banishing away any shadows in the corner. Especially because the final written pages are stained with a long-dried liquid that, God, I still hope isn't what I think it is. And when my plane took off from Hori Boumediene the next morning, my window giving me a clear view of the sprawling Algerian desert stretching out away into the distance, I involuntarily shuddered. For months, I was unsure of what to do. I considered taking the journal to a historian or museum to verify its authenticity, but I'm worried that it will be simply written off as a hoax or a forgery. The few friends and acquaintances of mine I have shared a little of the contents with have met it with the same response. It has to be a stunt, just something to scare whoever bought it. Worse still, I've had some of the worst nightmares of my life, horrible dreams that wake me up covered in a sheen of sweat, even months later. Finally, though, after discovering this website, and more importantly, this particular page on it, I feel here would be the best place to share it. Written below, transcribed exactly as originally written, are all the relevant entries from Liam's last expedition. I may need to split them up into 2 parts due to the length of some of them. Let me know what you think of it when you're done reading. And if there is any shred of truth to what is written here, as much as it might cost me work in the future, I may never step foot in that part of the world again. Monday, 23rd of June, 1952. After a 4-month rest, another adventure is at hand. A fortnight ago, I received a call at home from a wealthy American, a business magnate by the name of Tally. Apparently, Mr. Danvers had boasted of my qualifications and invaluable help during his expedition to Mauritania at a luncheon with him. And when told of a similar endeavor that the man wished to embark on in the nearby country of Algeria, he instantly recommended me to him. I was already interested when he told me of his intentions, and after he quoted me the fee he would pay, I hastily accepted. The amount of money offered is the kind that not even many film stars in the country receive. Indeed, it is triple what Diana Dors was reportedly paid recently for her part in the last page. And with my dear sister's health always in flux, it is an amount I would be a fool to refuse. And so, after much planning and subsequent connecting flights from London, I am now in the city of Algiers, where the rest of our party have assembled. I first met Tally as he met me just outside the airport. A tall, lanky chap with thinning black hair, he instantly struck me as inexperienced with such expeditions. It set me a little on edge, if I may be frank. Too many parties have tragically failed due to such sponsors. Yet, as I was taken to a nearby cafe and introduced to the rest of the team, I felt somewhat relieved at the faces that greeted us. 3 of the expedition's 9 members are ones I have worked with before. Soren, a hulking giant of a Dane, Richter, a quiet yet intimidating German, and Moretti, whose boastful demeanor sometimes hides how brilliant of a leader the Italian can be. 3 of the other 4, excluding myself and Tally, are people who I've heard spoken of in similar circles. Blake is the group's archaeologist, a fellow Brit and alluring brunette who seems as if she should be on the movie screen instead of here. Corin is the group's medic, a bloke who earned the scars on his face from his time in the war. And Samir is one of our 2 guides, a man whose wild hair and beard doesn't seem to match the intelligence that I see behind his eyes. The final member of the group is our second guide, an almost gaunt young man no older than 20, whose name I was told is Tarek. He did not speak when introductions were given. Instead, he merely nodded at us. I find he gives me an uncomfortable sort of aura, but according to both Tally and Moretti, he is indispensable to our ultimate goal, which is when discussion shifted over to our ultimate aim. In a hushed tone, Tally leaned in and told us of a tale he had stumbled across during his dealings in the area. He had hinted about a great treasure lost in the desert decades ago over the phone, but as I listened to him extrapolate, I felt my jaw drop open. According to accounts, a decade and a half or so ago, a group of soldiers belonging to the French Foreign Legion searching for a safe haven had stumbled upon a fortress built into a vast mountain range. Centuries old, the structure had been abandoned, and after discovering that a pump connected to an underground water source of some kind, the soldiers had set up a base camp, complete with radio and arsenal. They stayed in contact with their superiors for approximately 5 months, reporting back periodically and requesting supplies. Then, on the 6th month, the fort went silent. No matter how long it was hailed, no one ever answered the radio calls. A reinforcement group had been sent to try and ascertain what had happened to them, but they seemed to disappear into the desert as well. Eventually, all of the men were declared lost in action. It wouldn't have been the first time that soldiers had met their end on the receiving end of the local swords and guns, after all. Fearing further casualties, the fort was declared a hostile zone, and any further attempt to reach it was forbidden. as the years went by, and with the outbreak of the war, the fort's location and the reports on it were lost in the shuffle, further hampered by the fact that it seemed someone in a high position had stricken it from all maps and public record. But somehow, after hearing the stories, Tally had used his connections to obtain one of the only remaining maps which marked its location. As he finished, I cocked an eyebrow and asked him how this all connected to what he had lured me here with: the reports of a vast, lost treasure. An almost childish smile spread across Tally's face. "You ain't heard the best part yet, my dear boy." That was when the penny dropped. According to a radio report that the fort's commanding officer had made, they had found, in the bowels of the fort, a room which, when breached, had revealed a staggering amount of jewels, coins, and other treasures. The exact monetary value it had never been calculated, but seeing as how most of the hoard was dated back to the Ottoman Empire, it had to be a tremendous amount. By this point, our sponsor had our undivided attention, and dreams of being forever logged in the history books danced in our heads. That's when Tally let us in on the most important fact of this expedition. If we locate the fort and find the treasure was only a tale, or fail to find it at all, you all will be paid the exact amount I quoted you, he began, his eyes twinkling. But if we do find it, each of you will receive an equal share of the treasure, in addition to your names forever written as the finders. To say that you could have heard a pin drop amongst us would be a grievous understatement. For a moment, nobody spoke. I was the first to open my mouth. Yes, bloody hell, yes. As if my words had been a sort of catalyst, everyone else quickly piped up with their own agreement. Tally beamed. He knew he had ensnared us, and he reveled in it. He told us that we would board a plane bound for Insala the next day. From there, we would continue on in Land Rovers into the desert itself. And with that, he bid us good night, retiring with Moretti to their hotel. After a few drinks, the rest of us disbanded as well. And now, here I sit, staring out the window at the rising moon with my pen in hand. I am beyond thrilled. The prospect of becoming wealthy beyond my wildest dreams, of being able to afford all of my sister's medicine and procedures, to say nothing of my own frivolities and fantasies, is intoxicating. And yet, I can't help but feel a strong sense of trepidation over what I was told as well. The fact that two different groups of soldiers seem to simply disappear without a trace, it gives me pause. Even though I attempt to push it away, a small whisper of dread climbs over me. I picture the men cowering in the night, guns frantically aimed into the dark as something moves towards them. But surely, anything that happened to them so long ago, any people who did them harm surely have moved on, which means we should be perfectly safe. I worry too much. Tuesday, 24th of June, 1952. I write this entry by the firelight next to my tent, the only thing that banishes away the almost impermeable darkness that stalks the edges of the flickering embers. Early in the morning, just before the sun rose, our team boarded a chartered plane and flew south to Insala. There, we found 2 Land Rovers, paint shimmering and fresh off the production line in Solihull. They had been specially ordered by Tally for the journey. Supplies and enough fuel to last us a fortnight were loaded on board, and after wedging ourselves inside the space that remained, we set off in a westerly direction, following the road past towns with names such as Ingar and Aulef. Finally, we passed through Regain, and after a last look back at civilization, we left the road and headed out into the desert itself. Saying that the intense heat would rival the flames of hell itself would not be much of an understatement. The sun beat mercilessly down upon our vehicles, turning them into saunas, and as we were attempting to conserve our water supply, soon we all felt the first inklings of heat exhaustion. After stopping to quench our thirst quickly, and following the blessed liquid with lunch, we continued on as the sun dipped lower into the sky. As I was riding with Tally, I had the opportunity to ask him about Tarek. The man still gave me a bad feeling, and I inquired as to why he was so important to our expedition. After all, I asked, would simply Samir not make a decent enough guide? It was then that he revealed to me the secret surrounding the man. Tarek was one of few men left alive who had seen the fort with his own eyes, or so he claimed. He had told Tally of a time as a small boy, traveling through the desert with his father and grandfather, and spying on the horizon, perched atop a mountain range like a sentry, the imposing structure. Both of his elders had warned him away from it, telling him that it was a cursed place. "Load of local superstitious bull," Tally said to me, waving a hand as if to physically repel the words. For my part, I too did not believe in such things, and yet, at his words, I was unable to suppress the shiver that flew up my spine slightly. It felt too coincidental, too close to the feeling of dread that fell over me last night. A second thought came to mind, and pushing away the emotions, I asked, with not knowing if the young man was telling the truth, how he could be sure he was not simply luring us into the desert for a sinister purpose. With a small, almost concealed wink, he raised his shirt, revealing a hidden pistol underneath in a holster. He informed me that several others were armed as well, and a shotgun and ammunition were among our supplies. "Liam, my boy, relax. I've thought of everything. We'll be ready, whether the locals have any surprises in store for us, or either of our guides do. Just enjoy the trip in the meantime." I pray that his confidence is not misplaced. We are a long way from where anyone could help us if things were to go belly up. And that isn't all. I'm the only member of our group still awake. All the others have retired to their tents, or in the case of Tarek and Samir, into the Land Rovers to sleep. The only sounds I hear are the crackling of the fire and the soft, almost lonely sound of the wind whistling in the darkness. And yet, I can't help but feel watched. Even though we are certainly the only people for miles, I feel as though eyes are upon me, upon all of us. It is a feeling that is most unwelcome, and it makes me again wonder about the fates that befell the French soldiers. I find myself shooting looks out into the dark every few lines I write, almost convinced I will see eyes staring back at me from the blackness. As much as I don't want to, I must retire to my own tent. Dawn will be here soon enough, and we will need all of our strength for the next few days. Thursday, 26th of June, 1952. After a second day of driving straight and following both the map and directions that Samir tells us that Tarek has given us, as the man speaks no English, we seem to have finally arrived at the base of a mountain range. According to Tarek, these are the mountains in question, and we are not far now, less than a day away. I crane my neck to look up at the imposing walls which rise high over our heads. I'm not a good estimator of such things, but I would not be surprised if the top lies hundreds of feet above us or more. If the fort is real, then how are we to get to it from down here? All questions that will have to be answered soon. For now, though, I will go and sit with the others, eat supper, and go to sleep. If we are being told the truth, tomorrow will be the day. Friday, 27th of June, 1952. It's real. I find that even as I write these words, I feel I'll suddenly wake up from a dream. And yet, right there in front of my eyes is the bloody thing. Tarek was indeed telling the truth, and it looks exactly as Tally heard. The structure is perfectly nestled atop and similarly among the mountains, surely built there by some Ottoman architect or soldier with a perfect idea of strategic planning. The fort has a clear view down to the desert where we stand below, and is set far enough back that the surrounding land acts as a sort of natural shield. It is the perfect choke point, to say the least. Churchill himself would be impressed. According to the Blake, the style and architecture is indeed indicative of the Ottoman Empire, either Arabic or North African. The three front turrets rise imposingly above the rest of the complex, their windows dark and unrevealing of their secrets. Surprisingly, and thankfully as well, there will be no need to worry about climbing. Tarek pointed us to a set of steps carved into the mountains themselves. They are fairly steep, but they surely beat the alternative. As it is late, we will make camp here at the base tonight, and in the morning we will pack all our supplies and make the climb to the fort itself. Finally, I must admit that the feeling I had in the desert 2 nights ago remains. In fact, it almost feels stronger in a way. But with the excitement palpable amongst all of us, I refuse to let it sour the mood. It will be stored away in the recesses of my mind. Tomorrow we begin to take a step towards both history and possibly fortune. Saturday, 28th of June, 1952. I write from inside the central courtyard of the fort itself. I was correct in my assessment that it would be a steep climb. But aside from a few scrapes among all and a bloody knuckle suffered by Soren, we reached the top uneventfully. From there, we found a path already made, albeit almost hidden by the ever-sweeping sands. But the cracked wooden rail that marked the edge of the cliff showed the way. After a trek of about a quarter of an hour, we found ourselves at a gate which marked the outer rim of the complex. The top was wrapped in barbed wire, and an unlocked gate sat half open in front of us. Richter, feeling that we would be better off closing it behind us, walked into a neighboring guard post and lowered a barrier to prevent anyone entering when our backs were turned. Together, we made our way up a steep path to the front of the fort itself. At the front gates, we discovered a relic from the First World War, a French FT tank, sitting empty and half buried in the sand. The turret faced away from us, back the way we'd come, and I wondered both how it had gotten up here and what it had been put in place for. With a last look at the armament, we pushed open one of the two colossal wooden doors and entered the fort. We found ourselves inside an expansive courtyard that stretched out before us and to both sides. To the right was what appeared to be a smaller courtyard of some sort, embellished with a few small bushes and date palms. Wandering over to it, I found that at the far end of the smaller space was a fountain, a rusted pump set into the back corner. Tentatively, I put out my hand, gathered some water from the fountain, and raised it to my lips. The water tasted somewhat stagnant, but otherwise was fine. Reaching out and operating the pump, I found it readily supplied fresh water. Turning, I found Moretti beside me. He smiled. "It's a water garden." "Well then, this solves any concerns of running out of water. There must be an underground lake or river somewhere beneath us." I agreed with him, and after a last look around at the peaceful scene, we returned to the others. After telling them of our discovery, we set our supplies down and began as a group to explore. Aside from the water garden, there were two main buildings inside the fort. The largest building, according to the rickety wooden sign hung by the front door, declared it to be the living quarters, while a second, sunken building was designated the arsenal. After a small deliberation, we chose to enter the main building first. The interior showed that nature had taken its toll on the fort. Beams had collapsed from the upper levels, and sand rose up in small mounds, making us have to navigate around the debris. The rest of the quarters were in much the same condition, though with much more signs of life. Pillows, rugs, and other furniture were around. There were also plenty of candles and lamps hanging from beams above, all of which we lit as we passed. We located the radio room, which I noted with a pang of unease had been vandalized. Both the radio and Morse code machines had been destroyed. Clearly, someone had not wanted anyone to send any messages or calls for help. What made the scene worse was the obvious signs of struggle which were ever present throughout the whole building. Some of the group didn't notice, but I saw that Soren and Richter, along with myself, the three who saw the most combat in our lives, did. The spilled chairs, crumpled blankets, and broken glass and wood all told a tale. It was one that made the feeling of dread rear its head in my mind. And worse, the feeling of eyes on me was at a feverish pitch. As we made our way through, my head swung about like an owl's, looking not only into the shadows, but up into the rafters as well. At one point, as I brought up the rear of the group, it felt as though fingers had slipped along the nape of my neck, and my pulse quickened, my breathing going shallow as I froze on the spot. Terror filling every fiber of my being, I whirled around, and found no one. All I could hear was the soft creaking of the building and the whistling of the wind outside. Not wanting to remain alone, I hurried after the others. After leaving the main quarters and with daylight fading fast, we made a quick pass through the arsenal, where we discovered a grisly scene. In the fort's jail, we discovered the remains of a man dressed in one of the old uniforms which designated him as part of the French Foreign Legion. His body seemed to cower in the far corner of the cell, away from any of the bars. Stranger still, Samir pointed out that he had locked himself inside. A set of keys could be seen by the desiccated corpse's hand. From what we could tell, the man hadn't died of any injuries either. Moretti surmised that he must have either perished from hunger or thirst. We retreated back to the courtyard after, where we set up camp in the water garden. For this, I'm eternally grateful. While the living quarters may offer more shelter from the elements than the tents, I would not be able to sleep a wink inside. I feel constantly on edge after what has been seen today, and I pray to the Lord that in time they will fade from memory. And I still feel we are watched. In fact, the feeling is stronger than it ever was. As if whatever is doing the watching is almost directly over us, staring down. I wonder if the feeling has anything to do with the corpse in the Arsenal jail. After all, what could drive a man to such terror that he would rather face a slow death from lack of food and water than it? Perhaps, I hope I never find out. Nor where the rest of the soldiers disappeared to. I hope we can find the fabled treasure quickly and be gone from this place. As much as I love adventure, I long for being back in the bedroom of my home in Maidenhead. Monday, 30th of June, 1952. 2 days have passed since my last entry. We have continued to work to locate any hint of the treasure, but have failed to find any trace of it anywhere in the fort. I am beginning to think it may never have existed. Tolly is trying to bolster all our spirits, but I can sense him begin to grow weary. Like the rest of us, that foreboding feeling that has hung over my head like a noose seems to have spread among the expedition. I see it in all of their faces. It increased when we found more signs of a struggle around the fort. Fingernail marks etched into walls as if someone were dragged away, spent ammo casings and more. I catch others swinging around erratically, as though they had sensed somebody near them. I caught Samir, Tarek, and Corin huddled together, whispering softly to one another. When I approached, hearing words about leaving spoken, they stood up straight and gave me a strange look before moving quickly away. I also find that Blake tends to stick close to me now. She says it's because she feels safest with another from Britain, but I know there's a deeper reason she will not admit. Back in the war, my sergeant had told me that paranoia is one of the forces that whittle men down the quickest. I do believe he is right. Tuesday, 1st July, 1952. We are trapped. During the night, I awoke to hear a thunderous crashing sound, but in the darkness, I didn't know what it was. When daylight broke, we set out for the steps down to the Land Rovers. We found that, during the night, something had caused a large section of them to give way. Whether it be a crack in the rock which caused a landslide of some sort, it doesn't matter. The section is too vast to be able to safely jump down from, a gap of over 200 feet, and without rope, we couldn't climb down. We are stuck, hundreds of feet above the desert floor, with no signs of people anywhere. Fortunately, Tarek informed us through Samir that he believed as a boy he had seen a way down, further down the ridge. After a quick deliberation, it was decided that Samir, along with Richter, would set out and try and find it. The weapons we had brought were finally broken out from our supplies, and the 2 men were given a pistol each, along with a small supply of extra ammunition and 2 torches. They said they would attempt to return at nightfall if they could not find a way down. It is dusk now, and they have not returned yet. I worry that they may have slipped and fallen to their deaths, or worse, may have successfully made it down and bolted. While I may have worked with Richter before and heard good things about Samir, in a situation like this, even the most rational men can do the wrong things. I wait. I thought I just heard something. The silence has fallen again over the fort, but for a second, as the wind had died, I almost swore I heard a cracking sound in the distance. 2, 3 times, then nothing. But it sounded too small to be gunshots. It can't have been. I hope they come back soon. Wednesday, 2nd of July, 1952. Samir and Richter never returned. At dawn, I volunteered to try and set out to find any trace of them. Blake asked to accompany me, as did Corin, who said if they were injured, they would need his training. So, gathering the medical kit, we prepared to leave when Moretti stopped us. "I want you to take this," he said. Reaching into a supply bag, he withdrew the shotgun, what I instantly recognized as a Winchester Model 1897. Handing it to me, he also pulled out a box of shells and passed them to Blake, who placed them in her pack. "Be safe, and God be with you," he said. I nodded, and holding the gun tightly in both hands, the 3 of us stepped out of the fort and, after locating 2 sets of footprints, set out following them. None of us spoke a word as we followed the trail along, occasionally having to navigate around boulders and past treacherously narrow paths in what I hoped would lead us to our compatriots, our friends. But as we continued on, the footprints seeming to endlessly continue, I began to feel as though we three had, like them, seemingly slipped into an alternate reality where we would forever be trapped, alone. That was when we discovered the end of the tracks. I don't mean to say that they led to a way down, or even to the edge of the cliff. Rather, both sets came to a halt in the middle of an open space, dominated by low-hanging cliff faces behind us. This doesn't make any sense, Corin said as he looked around. Where in the hell did they go? Neither of us could answer him, but as I focused again on the tracks, I noticed two small details I hadn't before. Ones which made my heart begin to beat quicker in my chest. The first was that the footsteps, once so orderly and in rhythm with one another, suddenly began to erratically dance around each other, almost as if the men had begun wildly spinning around, looking in all directions. The second was the glint of brass I saw almost hidden among the sand. I reached out with one hand, and brushing away the top layer that had settled over it the night before, found myself looking at several spent bullet casings. There were approximately 3 or 4 of them, all clumped together as though someone had emptied a revolver on the spot. I picked one up, rolling it over in my fingers. The beating sun had made it almost too hot to handle, but I could instantly tell they were fresh. Wariness and dread began to gnaw at my insides. Something had happened here. That was when I heard Blake gasp. Turning, I found her staring at a section of wall behind and to the left of us, a section which had been obscured by an overhang before. Her face had gone as white as a sheet, and her eyes as wide as saucers. With a trembling hand, she pointed at something and moaned out 3 words. Mother of God. A single smear of blood ascended the rock face. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough to spike my dread into full-blown terror. Quickly arching my neck, I couldn't see where it would lead to, but was obvious that its owner had been dragged upwards, and in a violent manner. Instantly, I raised the shotgun, feeling my hands go cold and clammy. Blake and Corin huddled behind me as we all looked around rapidly, both at the overhang above us and farther down the path. All I could hear was the whistle of the wind, nothing more, and that fact alone terrified me to no end. That whistle, the silence, it all seemed to hold a threatening edge to it now. A prelude to something horrific to come. I motioned silently for the others to begin to back up behind me, alternating the shotgun's aim between the area above us and in front of us. Trying not to make any noise, we slowly began to move back to the fort. As we retreated, I swear I thought I heard the small pitter-patter sound of pebbles moving. I thought I saw a slight blur of motion just beyond my line of sight. My heart was racing in my chest, and my mouth turned as dry as cotton. In my time during the war, I had bore witness to many horrific sights, many atrocities. More than once I was sure I was about to die, and I swear on my sister's soul that I never felt as terrified as I did in those moments, my hands holding the gun beginning to shake. Despite feeling as though whatever had taken Samir and Richter were lurking just beyond our field of view, we made it back to the fort unharmed. As soon as we were inside, I dropped the shotgun to the ground, and Richter and I found what must have been the board to barricade the front doors, working together to pick it up and slam it into place in the large metal hooks. As we did so, the others raced out from the water garden, demanding to know why we were sealing them inside. Corin turned to them as we finished, his eyes wild and face ashen in the fading light. Because Samir and Richter are fucking dead, that's why. His use of profanity slammed the words home, and I saw horrified looks cross everyone's faces. Even Tarek's, even if he couldn't understand us that well. Trying to remain calm, I stepped forward and with as much rational clarity as I could muster, explained in crystal clarity everything we had seen, everything we had come across. As I finished, a deathly silence settled over us all. In those moments, all we could hear was the wind, which had now risen from a whistle into a howl. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, and it cast eerie shadows over the fort's courtyard. Nobody dared speak as the implications of our predicament sunk in, until I began to hear a low whine. For a moment, I was unable to discern where it came from, but as I looked around, I realized it was coming from Tarek. The Algerian looked, if possible, petrified to death and beyond. His face held the expression of one which had just had a death sentence passed on. The whine intensified, and he suddenly began to babble, speaking rapid strings of sentences that I didn't understand. "What is he saying?" Tally demanded. Moretti, knowing a little Arabic, raised a hand to silence him and stepped forward, asking a question to the panicking man. In response, Tarek babbled some more at him, and after a moment, I saw Moretti's brow furrow in confusion. He asked another question and received another panicked response. Tally stepped forward. "What did he say, Alessandro? Please tell me." Moretti continued to look at Tarek for a moment, then turned towards us. "I'm not sure, but I think he says that they are in the mountains. They hunt in the mountains, and they are why his father and grandfather warned him to stay away from here." Suddenly, and without warning, Tarek turned and bolted for the fort's living quarters. I saw Moretti begin to take a step after him, but then stopped. We watched as the man slammed his shoulder into the door, rushing inside and slamming it shut behind him. Fortunately, we did not hear it lock. After a moment, Tally turned back to us. He took a deep breath. "All right, everyone, we need a plan." The man's words seemed to bolster us, and we quickly and quietly began talking amongst ourselves. We decided it was no longer safe to stay inside, and following Tarek's footsteps, we would shelter at night in the living quarters, barricading ourselves inside. We would also try and repair the broken radio to try and send a call for help. Blake, in addition to being an archaeologist, was also proficient in repairing equipment. Our plan set in motion, we grabbed our supplies from the tents and moved inside. And now, we all huddle, trying to sleep in shifts in one of the main bunk rooms. Blake sleeps beside me. I can hear her uneasily rolling over as I write. Corin is doing the same a few cots away. Soren and Moretti patrol the halls of the building with 2 of our 4 remaining guns. Tally holds on to the 3rd, and in the meantime, I've traded Moretti the shotgun for a pistol of my own. I know I should try to rest. My own patrol shift will be in a few hours. And yet, I cannot. I feel as though my dreams will be worse. Dreams seeing what happened to Samir and Richter, seeing them dragged upwards to a fate I feel it is a blessing to not know. And I'm terrified that if I close my eyes, I will open them to find something looking at me, half hidden in the shadows from the dull light of the lamp over our heads, ready to leap and end my existence in a blister of pain and horror. God, please save us.